Living history, World War II stories as told by those who were there.
The Japanese made their first move to crush the US Pacific Fleet at the beginning of May 1942. They had been stung by the raid on mainland Japan, flown by 16 Mitchell bombers under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. The Japanese High Command decided to implement Yamamoto's Midway proposal. First, however, they proceeded with their plans to extend the footholds they'd gained in New Guinea by putting troops ashore near Port Moresby. And they continued with their air raids on the port of Darwin in northern Australia. These were a reminder of how close the Japanese had come to cutting the Australians' lines of communication with the United States. Throughout April 1942, hypo decrypts were building a picture of Japanese plans to mount a large operation in the area of Port Moresby. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, ordered Admiral Fitch's Task Force 11, with the carrier Lexington, 2 heavy cruisers and 6 destroyers, south from Pearl Harbor. They were to rendezvous with Task Force 17, commanded by Admiral Fletcher in the carrier Yorktown, in the Coral Sea approaches west of the New Hebrides. The arrival of American carriers in the area came as a great shock to the Japanese. But it was not until the 8th of May that both sides located the other's carriers and launched strikes. The ensuing battle was the first in which the opposing fleets never caught sight of each other, but did battle instead with the enemy's carrier-borne aircraft. The Americans lost Lexington, badly damaged by a Japanese strike, but Lexington had not been lost in vain. The Japanese carrier Shoho had also been sunk, and the Japanese drive on Australia halted.
And after that, we participated in the Battle of Coral Sea.
And what were you flying?
F4F3s, Wildcat.
Okay.
Yeah, the first day of that event, I was fortunate in that I guess I was number 4 in a flight of fighters led by the skipper. And we covered the TBDs of Torpedo 2. And our target was a carrier north of the Lewisades, which is a group of islands east of New Guinea. We flew over these islands, and there was a Jap carrier. It was underway, birds taking off, and there were some zeros in the air. Well, of course, we immediately scrambled with the zeros. Fortunately, we had them outnumbered. And I found that the Wildcat wasn't a particularly great adversary for the Zero because the Zero could outmaneuver us. However, we survived that. I had the privilege of seeing that Jap carrier being sunk.
The Shoho?
Pardon?
The Shoho.
Yes, that's correct. It was really quite interesting because it was a perfectly coordinated attack. The dive bombers from the Lexington and Yorktown dove simultaneously with the 2 torpedo squadrons surrounding the ship.
Mm.
And the ship was totally afire, and it sailed under the water. It was the most spectacular thing you could possibly see. Interesting, shortly after watching the ship go down, I found myself alone. And I headed back, I suppose it was south. And about that time, I noticed a seaplane down below me, just a perfect place for a high-side run. So I made a high-side run on the seaplane, and we exchanged fire, and I saw my tracers hit him. He hit me once, and then I pulled away. I never did see him. I saw a splash, but I couldn't be definite about that event. However, I joined one of the torpedo planes, and we got back to the ship. Fortunately, I was getting pretty low on fuel, and there was no delay. I landed, taxied up to my parking spot, ran out of gas. Well, the next day, I was all set to take off, but my plane was last in the pack, and they had not quite completed a repair job on the fuel bladder. Periodically had to change the fuel bladder on the Wildcats of that era. So I was delayed in takeoff, and they told me to shut the engine down, run back in the radio room, and the first attack came about then. It was pretty rugged, but I don't know the time elements, but it was quite a lengthy attack, and I felt 3 or 4 torpedoes hit, I'm guessing now, of course, and a bomb hit on the port side, just outboard of number 1 elevator. Fortunately, the ship survived the initial attack and was underway. And ultimately, I took off. I think it was probably the last to take off in the Lexington, and ultimately landed on the
Yorktown.
85, and flew the next 3 or 4 days with that activity, which is flight 42, I guess. Did a great job with damage control, but of course, again, the fact that it had an antiquated fuel system, no way to bring inert gases into the fuel tanks, which was the case of the later carriers. So they couldn't purge the tanks, and as a result, the fires adjacent to the tanks caused the tanks to cook off and explode, and that's ultimately what killed the ship. It wasn't the torpedoes.
Yeah.
It was that very fact that we had an antiquated system.
Yeah.
Plus the fact that, of course, the Lexington had a greater turning radius than the later carriers, and it could not outmaneuver torpedoes as the newer carriers could.